First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to talk about the characteristics of the Argentine model. The presentation has 4 parts. The first part has to do with what we call the moral basis of a model. These are the lines on which politics in general and economic politics in particular are guided. Once we explore this in abstract definitions, we pose as a setback what Argentina has done in the last 100 years and what has sunk it. Once we understand this relationship, we find the initial data and the policies that we implement. From there, we explain how we are going to generate economic growth. In the sense, the basis of our model is the idea of liberalism according to the definition of our highest exponent of the ideas of freedom in all history, which is Professor Alberto Vinicis. Who points out that liberalism is the unrestricted respect of the life projects of your neighbor, based on the principle of non-aggression in defense of the right to life, liberty and property. Whose institutions are private property, free markets for state intervention, competition understood as a process of entry and exit, not in the neoclassical idea but in the Austrian idea. This is the division of labor and social cooperation. This is a system of success in the economic imperative of serving your neighbor with goods of better quality at a better price. This system, which seems abstract, applies to different components of all areas of politics, and today we are going to focus on the economic issue. Specifically, what I am going to do now is describe how the decadence of Argentina has occurred and basically show how Argentina has systematically destroyed these concepts. And how we have systematically moved away from the liberal paradigm to turn Argentina into a catastrophe. Yes, that phone is tremendous. It's mine, isn't it? I tell you what happens. We have announced that I was going to broadcast it on my Instagram channel, and there is always a bad-natured idiot. Because the one who is doing this knows what he is doing and knows that he is interrupting the talk. Argentina is like that. It has a lot of famous heads that do this kind of things. In some cases we call them octopus heads. Do you know why octopus heads? Because octopus has its digestive system in the head, which makes it full of excrement. So, having said this, those friendly people who are trying to interfere in the conference, well, they will know that in a debate they had in front of them, so imagine that they can expect anything from Argentina. There it is, those the octopus head. and it will not stop because they did not want this to be translated. So what we see is the symptoms of the Argentine decline was for example, to see how Argentina lost places in terms of the GDP per capita ranking. If you take the estimates of Angus Madison, at the end of the 19th century, Argentina was one of the 3 countries with the highest GDP per capita on the planet. It was the land of prosperity, the land of abundance. In fact, it competed hand in hand with the United States. However, after gradually embracing ideas of socialism, Argentina became a real catastrophe. When we came to power, Argentina was clearly below the average. And obviously, that was also translated into a substantial increase in poverty. Although the official accounts show levels of poverty slightly above 40%, the reality is that this is a semi-annual average. And that when a variable is in growing trend, let's say if we show in December the average of the last semester, they are understating poverty, not because they are lying, but because of a simply methodological question of the averages. In addition, another thing that the statistics do not reflect is that Argentina, having had price controls, Argentina was suffering a shortage, and that is not captured in the indicators. So one of the situations that could happen is that to stay healthy with the statistics, we could have left everything the same, not just anything, and in that context the people statistically would have been fine. But they would have starved because they could not have bought anything in the supermarket. So what we decided was to be honest with the situation, because basically in that way the products would reappear in the stores. And that sincerity meant finding 57% of the poor, which is the number registered in January of 2024. On the other hand, inflation, when we arrived, was running at more than 1% daily, and then it accelerated more during the second week of December. The wholesale inflation, which is the one that leads, was running at 54% monthly. I know that there is a whole criticism of when I annualize this year, and I say that that has been done at 17,000%. When I do that account, I make clear the different imbalances that we had. We had a money overhand, which was double what we had prior to the Rodriguez crisis, which was a situation that multiplied by 6 the inflation rate, so at least we had to multiply the inflation rate by 12 times. At the same time, they left us in the central bank for monetary basis that they won in one day in passive remuneration. That means that in one day we could have multiplied the amount of money. So multiplying the amount of money would not have been strange to the rate that we brought. We also had savings in debt in pesos for the equivalent of $90,000 million. Therefore, if one takes all those elements, Argentina would reach inflation levels of the order of 15,000 to 17,000%. With all that wave of money, it would have been quite simple. If the demand for money had not fallen, which they know is not true. Therefore, we have these explanations. I cannot be doing them in public, because generally people do not have to know about economic issues. That is why I always simplify with the analyzation of the number. On the other hand, that situation would have also implied a generalized default. because clearly we could not have honored the debt in pesos. Clearly we could not have honored the commercial debt. Therefore we could not have honored the debt in general, with which we would have had a commercial breakdown of the economy, and that would have also made the situation much more difficult. And also Argentina was facing a situation of high positive pressure. So the question is, how did they get to this disaster? Since there had already been 2 hyperinflations, and they're the justification to begin to see how the model is intertwined, is what in Campania I call the model of the caste. The model of the caste has 2 elements. Obviously, it has an aberrant phrase from the socialists, which says where there is a need, a right is born. The problem is that the needs are infinite, and someone has to pay for the right, and the resources are finite. So we have a problem of infinite needs with finite resources. For economists, that does not represent a problem, because we know that through the economy of the free market, that can be resolved efficiently. But that is not the solution that politicians like. Politicians prefer to use a much more brutal and violent method called social justice. Social justice is an aberration from a moral point of view. And naturally, as expected, it would generate bad results. That is because the question is, who here is in favor of robbery? Nobody. Clearly, because in fact it is a sin. To steal is wrong, it is a sin. We already know since Moses came down from Mount Sinai and brought the tablets, one was he will not steal, and the other implies an unequal treatment against the law. Let's say someone is in favor of people having privileges, and that some have been rewarded and others punished because of the law. There is someone who is against equality before the law, while social justice is aberrant because it is robbery and implies an unequal treatment against the law. That is, in front of 2 individuals, one steals his income, part of his income, and gives it to another. Therefore, there is robbery, and there is an unequal treatment against the law. This, in addition, generates a serious problem of incentives, because if the one who generates wealth is being punished, and the one who basically kicks and shouts, because this is unfair, they give him money, then the incentive is to kick and shout and complain, and not work, with which it generates a system of incentives incompatible with progress. At the same time, it also has consequences in the quality of life for society. But not only for its damage in the economic, but for the damage in the links between people, promoting and strengthening an enviable society. It makes the climate within society extremely hostile. Today, society lies confronted by a supposed class struggle. And in that sense, the quality of the link is very bad. And there is a lot of distrust in society, is hyperpolarized. And what reigns is hatred. Because, of course, there is one who produces wealth and steals it, and there is another who says that he has the right to appropriate the wealth of the other. So, it's like living in a permanent war. And everything, let's say, for adhering to bad economic theory, that is, as Hayek said, if the socialists understood economics, they would not be socialists. In fact, I would tell you that the truth is that Marx was brutally destroyed. already by Eugene von Barak, in a book called The Conclusion of the Marxist System, where he proved all the inconsistencies of the system. Marx had already been exposed when Menger presented the principles of political economy. And not only that. After that, he was beaten by Mises in the book Socialism, explaining that socialism could not work due to the problem of economic calculation. Hayek demonstrated, let's say, on the path of disservice, let's say, how the interventions derive in that sinister system. And the reality is that the empirical evidence shared real socialism does not work was in 1989, when the wall fell, and in reality, the real evidence that those ideas do not work was in 1961, when they had to build it. So basically, the question is, why are they still pushing this garbage? The question is, why do they still adhere to this garbage? If they were defeated in the theory of value, if they were defeated in the design of the structure of the theory, if they were destroyed in dynamics, in problems of economic calculation, if they were destroyed by empirical evidence, why are they still adhering to it? Because the theory of the exploitation of properties, that is to say, the theory preceding the theory of Marx's exploitation, uses the theory of the work value as a mechanism to explain exploitation. And that is the moral basis there. It is envy, hatred, and resentment. So now, having said this, what is the consequence? At the social justice program, the consequence of the social justice program is that it has to be corrected with the grip of the state. That is to say, they do not believe in the invisible hand of the market. They believe in the fist of the state. They believe in stealing from someone to give to another. That is to say, as if they had some justification. That is to say, as in what? I want to do charity with this group. No, I am going to do it like this. I want to do charity with this group, the one on the left, stealing from the group that is on the right. So I put a gun to their heads, and I take the money to give it to them. It is in the buying question. How am I going to explain to this group that I am stealing from them to make a profit? Charity is not at a gunpoint. Charity has to arise naturally, not because of violence. This can only be resolved by the market. That they do not believe in that. So, social justice, when it starts, how does it manifest? As a fiscal deficit, as an increase in public spending. Yes, and then now comes a problem of how we finance it. Because it is a bit violent to be putting this poor group, a gun on their heads. So, what does a politician do when he is populist? That is, he tries to make the cost be paid by another, and nobody sees it. Therefore, the first thing he uses is a tool. A politician, what is it? Debt. And why does he do that? Because debt is future taxes. So, today's party, that this group is going to enjoy, that also Gina after us, that everyone is going to vote for the politician, he does that. That they are also more than the group that is here. It means that it is deeply moral. Because they are passing the bill for today's party to future generations. That is, there are people who are not born today and have to pay for this party. That is, taking on debt is absolutely moral. That is why it is notable in our economic policy. The deficit era. The deficit era was not taken like that. Because yes, it is a moral definition. It is beyond macroeconomics. It is a moral issue. It cannot be charged with the cost of the current party to future generations. And in fact, everyone knows We are working on a program to get new funding, but that funding is to repay the debt that the Treasury has with its maximum creditor, which is the central bank, so that the creditors of a central bank, the peso holders, get out of the scam of the different governments that went to install the reserves of the central bank, violating the quality of the assets that back at passive cold ways. This is no less because the more insolvent the central bank, the higher the price level is required to liquefy that monetary passive. Therefore, the more broken the central bank is, the higher the long-term price level is. Therefore, if I take today's price level and I take it against that price level, that line, that slope, that line is the implicit inflation rate. Therefore, as we are healing the heritage of the central bank, something that we have been doing systematically, what will ensure is that the heritage recomposition, the long-term price level is lower, and therefore the implicit inflation rate is much lower, and it is a way to end forever. But the problem of inflation, the other way to do it, is by issuing money. And by issuing money, precisely, we generate inflation. I say for many years, in Argentina, there was a monstrous stupidity that said that inflation is multi-causal, and we seem crazy to those who defended the monetary hypothesis of inflation. And of course, it is like saying that inflation is multi-causal. It is like talking about the obese skeleton, the hot ice cream, the Virgin Madonna, things like that. But well, we had to arrive to prove that inflation was a monetary phenomenon. But that inflation, in the end, ends up being a tax. And it is a tax on the most vulnerable sectors. In fact, one of the things that we were very convinced is that by lowering the inflation rate, we are going to lower poverty, and effectively in the monthly frequency, poverty fell from 57% to 33%. That is a lower 24 percentage points. That is in a little over a year. In 13 months, we took out of poverty more than 10 million Argentines. It was important to defend the monetary nature of inflation, and in the end, when the politician can no longer resort to that, because in fact, Argentina has been a serial defaulter. Argentina, let's say, has made aberrations with its currency. We took 13 zeros as of the currency. We destroyed 5 monetary signs. We could take out 3 more. But there comes a time when you can no longer. And then the politician always chooses to raise taxes. And that is why we have a country with one of the highest tax rates on the planet. So basically, that is why Argentina has a problems of high debt, of high inflation, of high positive pressure. Or, for example, this is very important. Without a doubt, the brilliant Minister of Economy that I have, Anarcho-capitalists, who is here, and who is, without a doubt, the best Minister of Economy in all of Argentina's history. In one of his first speeches, he explained something wonderful, and it is, the truth is that the central axis of Argentina, the central problem of Argentina is tax deficit. That is to say, last year we were the first government of the last 124 years that we had budget surplus. In the financial line, there are those who say, no, but there were 8 years. There were other years that there were also, yes, but we were not paying the debt. That is, it is as if we were not paying the interest. The first time we pay, let's say, honoring all the commitments, was this year that passed. In fact, Argentina, from 1901 to 2024, had 22 crises. Of those 22 crises, 20 had tax origin. And the tax origin between high tax imbalance and extravagant tax imbalance. But it is not only the impact that this has on the debts, on what inflation has to do, or what it has to do with the tax pressure. One of the things that different governments in Argentina have done is to apply price controls. And what happens when there are price controls? I mean, it generates scarcity. So if they find a supply law, the law of gondolas, or the law of gondolas, let's say, measures the gondolas. I mean, how can someone think of a law? Let's say it's like wanting to avoid the law of gravity with a law and walk with a centimeter and it falls on the rocks. I don't know, it's a truly directly insane thing. Or, for example, the typical populist situation that those in the cash risk mile, they made tax imbalance as they were so impresentable. They could not access the markets. They turned to monetary emissions. That monetary emission began to generate inflation. As inflation grew, they tried to prevent inflation from rising. They set the exchange rate, and when they set the exchange rate, international reserves began to be lost. And then, as they wanted to prevent international reserves from being lost, they created the CBR. The one we received was monstrous. Now it's much, much smaller. But this is interesting, because the CBR is neither more nor less a mechanism to artificially increase the demand for money. And see how insane this situation is. Because in the first place, what is violating the CBR is its consumption set. Let's say, because in the end, the Argentines also brought dollars to pass the consumption of the present to the future as a form of reserve of value. But not only that, then they forced them to have weights. And that artificially increased the demand for money, and therefore artificially increased the demand for money. Then see how the layout of regulations and controls also have to deal with what is always at the bottom, which is the fiscal imbalance. And the fiscal imbalance has a moral basis. Therefore, in that sense, we at the moment of arrival, then we find the fiscal deficit consolidated with 15 points of the GDP. That is 5 points in the Treasury, 10 points in the central bank, which generated endogenous emissions. That is, even when we had closed the fiscal imbalance. This was also explained by Minister Capita in one of his recent interviews. Even when we had put the fiscal accounts on the first day, as we did. And the most interesting thing is that even so, we would not have avoided hyperinflation, because we had 5, let's say 4 monetary bases in one day. In fact, if we have followed the recommendation of mass economists to raise the rate as they were suggesting us, if it had become an unmanageable ball, a snowball, and hyperinflation have been a fact. Apart from, as I was saying, we had debt payments in pesos, but the equivalent of $90 billion. We had debt with the XTV for $25 billion, and the agreement with the fund fell. In addition, we had negative international Versailles met at the order of $12 billion. In addition, the previous government, not only during the 4 years, issued 28 points of the GDP of money, and 3 were made during the election year. He also created a monstrous mechanism called SIRA, which was to have import permits. So that allowed them to access dollars at the official exchange rate. What a coincidence, but the exchange rate was tripled. There was a 200% gap. That is to say, a real scam. In addition, we had pending debt for dividends of $10 billion. And I had already told you how I had come to travel. I had already told you how I had come to travel to abroad, leaving the inflation. In that sense, from day one, we decided to make a shock program. And in that, the idea was to achieve the deficit year throughout the year 2024. They told us that it was impossible. It could not be adjusted more than 1 point of the GDP, that the policy did not allow us, and I did not know how many more things. And the reality is that thanks to the excellent work of the team of the Anarcho-capitalists, in the first month of management, we achieved the financial balance, despite the fact that in the month of January we paid interests. The original adjustment was 7 points of the GDP and 2 points of the GDP we used to give contention in the social part. And after 6 months, we also cleaned the balance of the central bank. That is completing a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of the GDP. Here it was also very important, the enormous task of the President of the Central Bank, Santiago Borsali, and the Secretary of Finance, Pavlo Kirchner, that as we were maintaining the fiscal balance with the course of the months, it allowed us to recover in the debt markets, and it allowed us to take out the debt that was inside the central bank and move it to the Treasury. Because in reality that had always been from the Treasury, and that is basically what the previous government did. In the previous year, it used Atalugios to put bonds to the central bank, and then the central bank issued them, and then they were sterilized on the other side. And then those huge remunerated passes appeared that generated a quasi-fiscal deficit of 10 points at the Atalugios. But as we stabilized the economy and showed fiscal solidity, it allowed us to rearm a weight curve and take out the debt from the central bank and take it to where it really had to be, which was in the Treasury. And in 6 months we managed to do that, with which we made this adjustment. It is also interesting because we took the wholesale inflation of 54%. Today, we have the truth that all the indicators are walking in terms of 1%. That is, this month it was about 5%. The wholesale was 0.8%. The basic basket total comes to 0.9%. The basic fruit basket also comes to 0.9%. The construction also comes to 0.9%. That is, all the numbers have been showing deflation in dollars. Given that the Krylon break was at 2%, it is more if one takes let's say in the exit is at 1.5%. That is, everyone comes clearly below 2% of the Krylon break plus American inflation. And one of the things they told us is that when we lowered inflation in this way, the level of economic activity was going to be destroyed, and that was going to make the level of activity collapse. Making it collapse in that the number of poor and homeless people was going to expire. The reality is that when one looks at other historical experiences, Adjustments of half of what we did have generated drops in the GDP of 15%. We in the quarterly had a GDP with a statistical drag of 2.8 negative. And according to the latest data, it is likely that in the quarter it ends with a drop of less than 2%. That means that there was expansion during the program. And indeed that is true, because if I take the data of the monthly GDP, which is the monthly estimate of economic activity, between December and December the GDP Argentinian economy grew by 4%. That is, we made the biggest adjustment in history. We lowered inflation, and it was also expansive. I believe that the books of economics and tax adjustment must have a reserved place for the task that is Manlo's Anarcho-capitalists done. But as I mentioned, not only that, but unemployment did not increase. We are creating jobs, something that Argentina has not done since 2011. But also the salaries in dollars basically tripled, the former ones. And poverty has fallen from 57% in the monthly frequency to 33%. Taking 10 million Argentinians out of poverty. In addition, about this, I want to make a note at the bottom of the page that I find it very important to be in this institution. Recurrently, during my way to the National Council of Deputies and my way to the presidency, I have cited a work of this institution on the inefficiency of public spending, which showed that the worst area in the world was Latin America, and that the worst of all was Sor Juana y de la Cruz, Argentina. I say this must be a mistake. I do not usually cite literature, I usually cite operas, but hey, today I was wrong. But in that since Argentina had technical inefficiency, let's say, by the equivalent of 7 points of the GDP. In the meeting that I just had with Alan and other members of the institution, they just told me that we have lowered it by half, so you have 3.5 points to go down. But it seems to me that there is something interesting about this experience that we can tell. And it is why having made such an adjustment was not recessive. This seems very important to me. And the adjustment was not recessive, basically, because the adjustment fell on the state. The adjustment fell totally on the state. And that happens when you have a parasite in the body. They do not kill the body, they have to kill the parasite. Well, we are willing to fight the parasite, anything possible. In that sense, we did not stop believing that the state is a criminal organization that lives from a coercive source of income that is taxes. In other words, no one pays taxes voluntarily. That is why one of the things that we maintain is that as we prove that growth is permanent, we are going to lower taxes. And in fact, we have just eliminated the country tax, which was a tax that collected a lot. We have lowered the retention. We have fully eliminated them for the regional economies. We have lowered them transitory for traditional crops. And we have also advanced in eliminating a lot of Arancel's taxes. So we are also dancing in that sense. And then now, having said all this, the point is, Stabilization is on the way, and what about growth? It is true that there is a part which is the cyclical recovery. Today, we are facing a cyclical recovery where basically the stocks are being recomposed. And with the recomposition of real wages and rentals in real times, that is pushing a demand. But there are other elements that make long-term growth. On the one hand, I would say the issue of having made the adjustment that we were doing. There's 15 points that the tax deficit economy had. It was a low level of savings and there were fewer opportunities for investment. Therefore, the fact of having made the tax adjustment and run into the middle state, that is what makes the saving basically recovered so that the private sector can invest. That is to say, it is false that we need to get out of debt to be able to grow. Because basically, given the fiscal shock that we have committed, that makes those a lot of savings to finance the private sector. Today, banks work as banks, not, let's say, as an auxiliary wheel of the public sector. Not only that, but we also made structural reforms. The structural reforms that we meet in the Executive Order 70 and in the Basic Law are 800 structural reforms. That is to say, 8 times bigger than the reform that Menem did, which was the biggest reform in Argentine history. Therefore, being that the government of Menem was the best government in Argentina, which through structural reforms and a successful stabilization program such as convertibility, in just 1 year, with 15% of the House of Representatives and 10% of the House of Senators, we made a structural reform 8 times bigger. And we also made a successful stabilization program, more successful than that of convertibility, because today we have better results in times of inflation in dollars, which we have in deflation, without having fallen into previous hyperinflation, without having expropriated, without price controls, without controlling the exchange, and also by reconstituting tariffs. That is why I always say that this is the best government in history. Not because of my merit, but because of the enormous ministers I have. Because I am proud of each one of them. Because of the enormous task where all I have to do is set the course. But they are instruments. It is a pleasure. Having said that, but everything did not stay here. From the middle of the year, Dr. Federico S. Zuniga was explicitly incorporated into the team. And we created a Ministry of Deregulation. Well, Federico is having a process similar to the one Toto has with me. Let's say we have a symbiotic relationship. With Federico, the same thing is happening. Then, in that first half year that Federico was there, which is the second part of last year, he removed 900 regulations. That is to say that they are also structural reforms. That is to say that we made 1,700 structural reforms. That is not all. Because now I am going to tell you an internal anecdote. Federico is implementing what he calls the motorcycle plan, which is to start going to the questions, to make another reform in the state. Remember that there were 18 ministries when I was elected, which are actually 24, and we take them to 9. Now we are 8. And we want to narrow down more secretaries and more dependencies. On January 15, I gave all my team a vacation. They all returned on the second part of January. And on the first days of February, the Minister of Sturzenegger came to visit me at the residence of Olivers. And then he told me that he wanted to see me. If he wanted to see me. And then he told me that he was extremely worried about the slowness with which we were acting. And then, for example, he suggested to me how to redefine some areas of legal to give more dynamism and agility to the reforms that are Co's argument. Being a minister who gives me joy every day with all the things that the state breaks down. And I said, let's say, how disconcerted I was that I did not realize that I was having little joy. Then I went and I realized how many deregulations he did in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, right? How many do you think he did? He was angry because things were messed up. 65. G realized that in 15 days. He removed 65 regulations and said that we were going slow. He said, how am I not going to be happy with my ministers? We are all a machine to gain economic freedom all the time. And this, I warn you, is going to continue. There is something very beautiful, which is Decree 125, which just came out in a few days, where the different ministries are instated to build a digest. This is a work of art, but you are going to see the shock. Argentina has 42,000 laws. Is that right, Manuel? Or 47,000? 42,000 laws, 70,000 decrees, and 220,000 circular resolutions. Obviously, the circular resolutions can be eliminated by a ministry. I have the decree as a decree. And some laws by the basic law and by the DNU. I can get it helped by special faculties. So what we are proposing is that each ministry make a digest of what it uses. And guess what we are going to do when we have the digest? They have 30 days to do it. Everything that is not in the digest is eliminated. Because you are going to find that there are things that you don't even know are there. You just know that it is that and it is beneficial. For example, it is very interesting what happened to us with the junk. You couldn't export junk. It was forbidden to export junk, of course. But junk is a price. So that junk was left in the domestic market and the price of the junk was falling and it was very cheap. Of course, that benefited a company. Well, let's say, and it harmed everything that the junk did. It seems that is not something in favor of freedom. So what did we do? We eliminated that regulation. Obviously, now the junk has a market price. But well, the company that was harmed is a very large company. It is a very large economic group and it took its army with 80 tasks for evaluation and tries to destabilize the economic program. Or, for example, I don't know the problem of a Sandy exporter. I wanted to export watermelon. Because I don't know how to say it in other places. Yes, I already extended myself. I apologize. It is funny, I have 3 or 4 things left and I'm done. But I wanted to give funny examples. I swear this is the last example I give and I finish with what I have to finish. So this man wanted to export watermelon to Paraguay. And he had an agreement with the Paraguayan businessman to export the watermelon. But it happens that the Argentine regulation said how he had to export the watermelon. And the Paraguayan businessman did not save him in that way, he served him in another way. So what did this man have to do? He had to do it as Argentine authorized him. He put it on the boat. Inside the boat he changed the whole format to adapt it as the Paraguayan businessman needed it, and so it came. A total inefficiency. We raised that regulation, and obviously that some kiosks in the middle fell. And some got angry, but let's say the sandy producers are happy now. And the Paraguayans too, because now they also receive it cheaper. Not only that, we continue to advance in what has to do with tax reduction. And there are two more issues that I want to point out. One is the issue of how we have changed the paradigm of social assistance in Argentina. We don't have the Ministry of, I don't know what it was called before, but all those names because, yes, for that, social welfare. You can imagine how it sounds to me, that's why I didn't get the name. I mean, those things are denied in my brain. Now we decided to create the Ministry of Human Capital. The Ministry of Human Capital has a whole connotation in economic terms and in social terms. In social terms it is, I'm not going to give you fish, I'm going to teach you how to fish. And if you have a company that brings out fish, even better. And basically what it does is give assistance and care, let's say, from those less favored in the family. That's why there is an area of childhood and family to give support when they are born. And that is linked to health, to education and to work. So that people will gain the dignity of being able to earn their bread with the sweat of their own forehead and not stealing it from others. That is, and this is making a revolution, not only because the social policy is working, which has given contention in the most complicated moment of the adjustment. In addition to the fact that we have removed the thefts from the picketeers and the managers of poverty, but we are also retaining dignity to the most vulnerable sectors and giving them tools so that they can get out of this misery. That is, it is a ministry that when it is fully successful and reaches its maximum point disappears. And the other is the ministry that Dr. Sterznik leads. And basically the central axis is that if you look at the history of humanity, at least since the year zero of the Christian era, the GDP per capita rose by approximately 50% between the year zero and 1800. But from 1800 onwards, while the population multiplied by 10, the GDP per capita did it 15 times until the year 2023, which is the latest data from the Angus Medicine series. So, in that sense, the question is that the opposite of that is growing performance. Now, if we look at it in terms of microeconomic analysis, that means that if I want to put it strictly technical, I have a problem of non-convex structures. But if we put it in more understandable terms for non-microeconomists or whatever, I have a problem of concentrated markets, or the most polar case would be the monopolies. And the real problem is that when I regulate the monopolies, and I want them to look like competitive companies according to the neoclassical paradigm, that ends up killing the growing performance. Consequently, by killing the growing performance, the economy stops growing. So, in the measure that is passed to regulations, what we are doing is not only gaining economic freedom, but we are also gaining economic growth. And all this derived from the fact that, from my point of view, that neoclassical analysis is wrong. For those who want to see this, I suggest you read the article by Murray Newton Mathberg, which is called Monopoly Incompetence, an article that was very revealing for me. Because when I read it, I spent 25 years giving classes on microeconomics and general equilibrium. And I discovered that monopolies are not bad. Unless they are armed by the state. That article was so revealing that not only did I become a libertarian liberal, but I also became an anarcho-capitalist, something that I still am philosophically. This means that I am not going to take the state to the minimum size and return freedom to all the Argentines to the maximum until the last day of my government. Thank you very much, and non-life freedom, damn it. Thank you very much, President, and we had a lot of fun. This is certain with the examples with the watermelon, with the octopus. I thought that the octopus was the one that had many hands, and that he was going to use it for the state, but he is using it too. I'm going to give him more applications, but what is important here is to think about how we can do this case here in a VOT. And use it for the conversations that we have with 26 countries. A fiscal consolidation, a fiscal adjustment that is expansive. An adjustment that has regulation, that simplifies, and that gives him the conditions for the private sector to be able to enter. And the last point is how to make sure that we have sustainable growth. Because when we talk to the heads of state, and we tell them we are going to make an adjustment of 5, 6 or 15%, they tell me, but our words are I. And they just tell us, well, you are going to be expensive and you are going to grow in the long term. So the question is, how do I answer the heads of state? So how do we know that the growth of the private sector is going to come? Good. The first point is that the adjustment doesn't have to fall on the private sector. It has to fall on the public sector. The magic is there. Second, we have to have conviction. I am going to tell you what happened at the first meeting of the cabinet. I had already agreed with Minister Capito that we were going to pass the motorway impudently on the public sector. And in that context, we had also planned the mechanisms of social containment and so on for the transition. So when we went to the first meeting of the cabinet, and I raised the guidelines, at the bottom of the meeting were all the lawyers, and they told me that cannot be done. Well, then I told him it was about 40 degrees. I don't know how it would be in Fahrenheit, the equivalent, but it was very hot. And then I asked him, and the question is, if I go to the corner and ask the ice cream maker, let's say, what is the answer he's going to give me? It cannot be done. So I told him, the truth is that I'm not interested in what you tell me. And the only answer I accept is that you tell me how to do it. I mean, because for it not to be done, anyone can answer me, it cannot be done. And I think that changed the way the ministers began to see the situation. And the other thing that is very important is to make the line clear of where one wants to go in there and understand the fallacies that economic theory contains. Can I be read? Be my guest. I say that public work generates growth and work is bullshit. That's a lie. Because the reality is that to do a public work, I have to finance it. And if I finance it with debt, it is a future tax. I punish our children, our grandchildren and others. If I finance it with monetary emissions, I punish the vulnerable with inflation. If I finance it with taxes, I punish the present generations. In addition, not only that, but let's say, like me, I am charging them taxes. That work that is being done there and that is actually being seen is destroying other works and jobs in other places. But in addition, people's preferences were not to have that row, but they wanted to have the other things they had chosen. So I'm stealing them, I am giving them goods that they did not want. Therefore, I have a loss of well-being in terms of less utility. And also, let's not forget that there's also the problem of public spending leaks. Therefore, what must be taken into account is that the government is part of the problem and not of the solution. There is nothing worse than a politician who comes and says, I am the government, I come to help. When a politician comes and does that, they run away. Because the only thing they are going to do is steal from them. So the central question is to understand all these fallacies, about which the like-all the state is built. Let's see, keep in mind that the state is a criminal organization. That is, you cannot tell me that with more thieves in society, they are better than with less. That is, the state is worse than the mafia. Because I ask you a question. How many times have the Bulgarian thieves been stolen? Over the last year? None. Well, the state steals them every day when it charges taxes. So how can it be that something so sinister? If I take it out, I'm going to be worse. If I take it out, I'm going to be much better. Because on top of that, the state is the stationary thief. And besides, it is more short-scaled. And it is less good than the mafia. So the day people decide to take the red pill, and get out of the matrix, to understand that the state is the problem and not the solution, surely we will have many more anarcho-capitalists.